Okay, so you know how sometimes the most basic ideas can be, well, kind of surprisingly tricky when you really start thinking about them?
Yeah, like the kind of stuff you end up debating late at night, maybe after one too many coffees.
Exactly. And today we're diving into a pair of concepts that are like that,
Hmm.
disease and health. I mean, on the surface, they seem pretty straightforward, right? But trust me, as someone who enjoys a good philosophical puzzle, these terms open up a whole can of worms.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we're turning to a source that's like the ultimate guide to this philosophical jungle, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on disease and health.
Oh yeah, that's a dense one, but it's packed with insights.
It is, and we're going to break it down for you so you don't have to wade through all that philosophical jargon.
Right. We're not going to get bogged down in the technicalities. Our mission today is to highlight the key arguments, the big picture stuff that's relevant to us, as people interested in the big questions.
Like, what actually is a disease? Can we really define it objectively, or is it all just a matter of perspective? And what about health? Is it just the absence of disease, or is there something more to it?
So this is like a guided tour through a particularly challenging but super rewarding philosophical landscape.
Right. And this entry really digs into how science, values, and even social norms all get tangled up in the way we understand disease and health.
And one of the first things it points out is how tricky it is to even define the boundaries of our topic.
Yeah, like where do we draw the line between what is and isn't a disease? I mean, you wouldn't say pregnancy is a disease, right? But it's definitely a medical condition.
Right. Or think about using contraception. It's a medical intervention, but not a disease in any usual sense.
Exactly. So the entry highlights this problem right off the bat, showing how slippery these categories can be.
And it gets even more complicated when we consider things like genetic predispositions or the natural process of aging. Are those diseases?
It's a tough question, and the entry really pushes us to think about these issues right at the start.
So we have this initial challenge of figuring out the scope of what we're even talking about. And then the entry takes us into the heart of the philosophical debate, which often centers around two major viewpoints: naturalism and constructivism.
Yes, and these two perspectives really represent fundamentally different ways of thinking about what a disease is.
All right, so let's unpack them one by one, starting with naturalism. What's the main idea here?
Well, the core idea is that disease is essentially an objective biological malfunction.
So something's gone wrong in the body.
Exactly. And the entry focuses on Bors's work, which introduces this idea of species-typical design.
Okay, so it's like comparing how someone's body is working to a kind of blueprint for how it's supposed to work.
Precisely. The idea is that our biological systems have evolved to function in certain ways that help us survive and reproduce. So for naturalists, disease is a deviation from that normal species-wide functioning. It's like a glitch in the system.
Okay, I get it. And I guess that makes sense, right? Our bodies are complex machines, and machines can malfunction.
Right. And naturalism tries to provide a framework for understanding disease in a way that's rooted in those objective biological facts.
But isn't there also the experience of being sick, like feeling unwell?
Right. And the entry makes a distinction between disease, the underlying biological malfunction, and illness, which is the subjective experience of that malfunction, the feeling bad part.
Okay, so you can have a disease like some biological abnormality, but not actually feel ill.
Exactly. It might not be causing any noticeable symptoms or affecting your life in a significant way, at least not yet.
That makes sense.
Hmm.
But even within this naturalism framework, it seems like there must be some role for our values, right? Like deciding whether a particular malfunction is bad enough to be considered a disease.
You're absolutely right. That's where the normative judgments come in, and even naturalists acknowledge that. I mean, we might be able to identify a biological difference objectively, but whether we consider that difference a disease often involves value-laden considerations about well-being and what we consider a good life.
It's like, yeah, maybe my body isn't functioning perfectly, according to some idealized standard, but does that really mean I'm diseased?
And the entry raises an interesting point about this. It suggests that maybe disease as a broad category is itself a concept driven by human interests, kind of like how we talk about weeds or vermin. It's a way of grouping things together based on our values and concerns. But the individual diseases within that category are still seen as objective biological realities.
So the overall category might reflect human interests, but the specific conditions themselves are still grounded in biological facts.
Right, that's the key distinction. So we've laid out the basics of naturalism. Now let's jump to the other side of the ring, constructivism.
Yeah, the challengers. What's their take?
Well, constructivists really shake things up. They argue that disease categories are shaped more by human interests, values, and social norms than by objective biological facts.
So it's more about how we interpret and categorize things than about some inherent biological truth.
Exactly, and that even the idea of normal biological functioning is influenced by our social and cultural perspectives.
That's a pretty radical idea, isn't it?
It is. It's saying that what we call a disease isn't some fixed reality out there, but a reflection of what our society values and fears at a particular time. It's a human judgment layered on top of biology.
So our cultural biases and values could actually influence what we consider a disease.
That's the constructivist argument. They see these disease labels as potentially being tools of social control or ways of stigmatizing differences that we don't like. And the entry even brings up the example of homosexuality, which used to be classified as a mental illness but isn't anymore. That's a pretty stark illustration of how social norms can shape what we consider a disease.
That's a huge shift. So for constructivists, it's not about an objective breakdown in the body, but more about how we as a society react to certain conditions.
Right, and this perspective really challenges the idea that there's some pre-existing set of biological malfunctions that just are diseases, regardless of context.
Okay, so that's constructivism in a nutshell. But the entry doesn't just present these two viewpoints as equally valid. It also explores some problems with each approach.
Right, and one of the main challenges for constructivism is explaining how we distinguish between being sick and simply being different, or between a real medical condition and something we just don't like.
Yeah, that's important. Not everything we dislike or find abnormal is a disease.
Exactly. And if disease is just a social construct, then how do we separate it from other forms of deviance or social disapproval? Like, imagine someone who has unpopular political views. We wouldn't call that a disease, right?
Well,
Even if they're really passionate about those views.
Okay, so just feeling strongly about something or being different doesn't automatically make it a medical issue. There needs to be more to it than that. And the entry brings up Saz's work here, which argues for a clear distinction between illness and mere social deviance.
Right. And this leads to another problem for constructivism. If we reject the idea of objective biological malfunction as a guiding principle, then what criteria do we use to decide which bad states are actually medically relevant?
Right. If it's all just subjective, then how do we know what needs medical attention and what doesn't?
Exactly. And Cooper's work explores this issue in detail, arguing that we need some way to differentiate between genuine medical conditions and other kinds of problems.
The entry also criticizes the ER test.
Oh, right. The idea that if something is so bad that you'd be rushed to the ER, then it must be a disease.
Yeah, that one. But as the entry points out, that definition is way too broad. I mean, you could end up in the ER for all sorts of things that aren't diseases, like a severe allergic reaction to something you ate.
Right. So the ER test doesn't really help us draw a clear line between medical and non-medical problems. And then there's Broadbent's subjective view, which tries to come up with a value-independent account.
Okay, what's that about?
Well, Broadbent compares health and disease to secondary qualities, like color. They're not objective features of the world, but depend on how we perceive them. His idea is that we have a natural disposition to notice when something in our biology is hindering our survival or reproduction.
So instead of saying disease is inherently bad, it's more about how we're wired to react to certain biological states.
Exactly. It's like our bodies have built-in alarm systems that go off when something isn't working right. But this also implies that disease isn't some objective thing out there independent of our perception.
Okay, so that's Broadbent's take. And the entry ends its discussion of problems for constructivism by highlighting a key argument from the naturalist side.
Which is?
Well, it points out that we're constantly revising medical diagnoses based on new scientific discoveries. And that suggests there's a real underlying biological basis to disease, even if our understanding of it is always evolving.
Right, like how homosexuality was removed from the DSM because our scientific understanding of sexuality changed. That's a powerful example of how biology can drive our definitions of disease.
And that brings us back to naturalism, but now with a better understanding of the challenges it faces. So earlier we talked about this two-stage picture that some naturalists use.
Right, the idea that we first identify a biological malfunction and then make a normative judgment about whether it's bad enough to be a disease.
Right, so how does that contrast with the constructivist view?
Well, it basically flips the order of priority. For naturalists who hold this two-stage view, the biological reality of the malfunction comes first. And then, as a separate step, we might consider the suffering or diminished well-being that results from it. But that suffering isn't what defines the disease. It's a consequence of the underlying biological problem.
So it's not that we see someone suffering and then decide they must have a disease. It's that we identify a biological issue and then recognize that it's causing them harm.
Precisely. The entry even mentions Spitzer and Endicott, who suggest that disease categories function as calls to action, signaling that something needs our attention and possibly intervention.
Okay, so within naturalism, there's this two-stage process. And the entry also distinguishes between simple naturalism and hybrid accounts.
Right. What's the difference there?
Well, simple naturalism is more straightforward, maybe even a bit reductionist. It basically says that disease just is the failure of an individual's body or mind to function normally.
Like a broken machine.
Exactly. Saz's view, at least in his earlier work, fits into this category, as do some of the initial formulations by Boris and Williams. They really focus on that biological or functional breakdown as the core of disease. But hybrid accounts, which include thinkers like Wakefield, later Boris, and Stiganga, add another layer. They agree that there has to be a biological malfunction, but they also argue that this malfunction has to have some negative impact on the individual's life to really count as a disease.
Okay, so it's not just about the biological facts, but also about how those facts affect the person's well-being.
Right. So even within naturalism, there are these different levels of complexity. And regardless of which version you subscribe to, there's still this fundamental challenge. How do we actually determine which biological malfunctions are diseases and which aren't?
That's a big one. How do we pinpoint the right causes and draw those lines?
Well, the entry discusses a few attempts. Culver and Gert, for example, tried to define disease in terms of a non-distinct sustaining cause of suffering. But this definition is way too broad, as the entry points out.
Right, it could end up classifying all sorts of things as diseases, even things that are clearly not medical problems.
Exactly. Like, the entry uses the example of racism. Under a racist regime, you could argue that having black skin is a non-distinct sustaining cause of suffering, but obviously that doesn't make black skin a disease.
Okay, so that definition is a no-go. What about Boris? Didn't he have a more specific approach?
He did. He focused on this idea of species-typical design and said that a malfunction is basically a failure to function according to that design in a way that impacts survival or reproduction.
So if something's preventing you from living a normal lifespan or having children, then it's a disease.
That's the basic idea. But even Boris's account runs into what's called the line drawing problem.
Meaning?
Well, how do we precisely define what counts as species-typical design and how much deviation from that design is considered abnormal? And the entry gives the example of tooth decay.
Right, that's pretty widespread.
Exactly. So if something's common in a population, does that mean it's not a disease, even if it's clearly harmful? That seems kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah, it does. So Boris's account, while influential, still has some kinks to work out.
It does. And the entry also mentions Williams's approach, which focuses on malfunctions within the intricate networks of cells as a more fundamental way to understand disease. It's a more micro-level view than Boris's.
Interesting. And what about mental illness? How does that fit into the naturalist framework?
Well, Wakefield applied Boris's ideas to mental disorders, emphasizing the role of evolutionary function and harm. But Cooper criticizes this approach, pointing out issues with things like contraception and chronic conditions that are managed by medication.
Right, like if you're taking medication to control a chronic condition, you might be functioning normally, but still have an underlying biological issue.
Exactly. So defining normal function can get really tricky in those cases. And the entry also highlights this debate about which scientific discipline really owns the concept of function when it comes to disease.
Like, is it just physiologists who get to decide, or do we need input from other fields, like evolutionary biology or even medicine more broadly?
Right. It's not a simple question.
Yeah.
But there seems to be some agreement that mechanistic explanations are really important for understanding how things work in the body and how those mechanisms can break down.
That makes sense. And this whole discussion about function really takes us into the philosophy of biology.
Yeah, there's a whole debate about how to understand biological function, and the entry touches on some of the key arguments.
So what are the main contenders there?
Well, there's the evolutionary view, which defines function based on a trait's history of natural selection.
So what it was selected for over time.
Right. And then there's the systemic view, which focuses on the current causal role that a structure or process plays within an organism.
Okay, so one's looking back in time and the other's looking at what's happening right now.
Exactly. It's like, why does a bird have wings? The evolutionary view says it's because wings evolved for flight, while the systemic view says it's because wings currently allow the bird to fly.
Ah, okay, that makes the distinction clear. And which view is favored in the context of disease?
Well, the entry suggests that medicine often uses a more immediate causal concept of function. It's less about what a trait evolved for and more about what it's doing right now in the body.
Okay, so a more practical approach. And are there problems with the evolutionary view?
Yeah, there are a few. For one thing, it can be hard to find evidence for the specific selective pressures that shaped a trait. And then there are things like the common cold, which don't seem to affect fitness or reproduction that much.
Right, so it's not clear how they would have been selected for.
Exactly. And there's also the issue of spandrels.
Spandrels.
Yeah, it's a term for biological features that didn't evolve for a specific purpose, but are kind of byproducts of other adaptations. So it's hard to say that they're malfunctioning in an evolutionary sense. And the entry points out that if we rely too much on this scientific functional analysis, we might end up with a definition of disease that clashes with our common sense understanding of being sick.
Okay, so even within naturalism, there's a lot of debate about how to understand function. And then there's the whole question of normality and how we account for individual variation.
Right. And the entry highlights Watchbroid's argument that what we consider normal in biomedicine is often an idealized model, not just a statistical average. It's a kind of blueprint for how things should work, which might not perfectly reflect the messy reality of individual bodies.
Right. So even if something's statistically common, that doesn't mean it's necessarily healthy.
Exactly. And Bourse, while he does include a statistical view of normality, acknowledges that it's not always sufficient. And then there's Izhevsky, who points out that statistical normality doesn't always align with our medical concerns.
Like tooth decay again.
Yep. And then King Verma adds another layer of complexity by pointing out that functions can be situation-specific. So something might be normal in one context, but not in another. And Hausman responds to this by emphasizing the impact on overall functional capacity across different situations.
So it's not just about whether a particular function is working, but also about how that affects the individual's ability to do the things they need and want to do.
Right. It's a very nuanced view. And the entry also touches on the problem of behavioral factors and different conceptions of what it means to flourish, especially in psychiatry. Like, what counts as normal behavior or rational thought can be influenced by culture and philosophy.
That's a big one, especially when we're talking about mental health.
It is. So as you can see, even this seemingly objective realm of naturalism gets pretty complicated when you start digging into the details.
Yeah, it's not as cut and dry as it might seem at first glance. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground on disease. What about health?
Right. Let's shift gears a bit. The entry points out that health hasn't gotten as much philosophical attention as disease, which is kind of surprising when you think about it.
It is. So what are the main ways philosophers have tried to understand health?
Well, the most basic view is that health is just the absence of disease. But the World Health Organization, for example, defines it more broadly, including physical, mental, and social well-being.
Yeah, it's not just about not being sick, but about thriving in different aspects of life.
Exactly. And as with disease, there are different philosophical takes on health. Hausman, for instance, proposes functional efficiency as a biological view of health.
So how well your body is working. But is that enough?
Well, Hausman himself admits that most accounts of health go beyond just biological functioning. They include things like quality of life and the ability to flourish. And Alexandrova argues that health is partly normative, meaning that value judgments are built into how we define and measure it.
That makes sense. Our ideas about what constitutes a good or healthy life definitely play a role.
Right. It's hard to separate the biological facts from our values when we're talking about health. And then you have more phenomenological approaches, like Carell's, which emphasize the lived experience of health.
So how it feels to be healthy, rather than just what's going on at a biological level.
Right. Carell talks about this feeling of being at home in your body as being central to health. But of course, there's the counter-argument that you can feel fine even if you have a serious underlying condition.
Yeah, our subjective experience isn't always a reliable guide to our actual health status.
Definitely not. And the entry also discusses environmental and functional views of health.
Like how our surroundings and our ability to adapt to them affect our well-being.
Exactly. Gadamer, for instance, sees health as being in harmony with your environment, both social and natural. And Kangelhem focuses on this idea of health as flexibility and adaptability, not just some fixed physiological state. And then there's Antonovsky's concept of sense of coherence.
What's that about?
It's about feeling like the world is comprehensible, manageable, and meaningful. So it's a more psychological, or even existential view of health.
Interesting. And what about theories that link health to goal achievement? I've heard of those.
Yeah, those are called embedded instrumentalist theories.
Hmm.
Nordenfelt, for example, focuses on vital goals, the things we need to be able to do to have a minimally happy life. And Richmond has this idealized self view where health is about being able to become the person you want to be.
So if you can achieve your goals, then you're healthy, according to these views.
That's the basic idea. But the entry points out that these theories can get a little blurry when it comes to distinguishing between health and well-being more generally.
Right, because achieving your goals might make you happy, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're physically or mentally healthy.
Exactly. And Whitbeck tries to address this by focusing on the psychophysiological capacities that support goal pursuit. So it's not just about achieving the goals themselves, but about having the underlying abilities that allow you to do so.
Okay, that's more nuanced. And finally, there's Schroeder's argument that health is a comparative concept, like tall or wealthy.
Right. And this means that it's not an absolute state, but rather something that exists on a spectrum. You can be healthier or less healthy compared to others or compared to yourself at different points in time.
That's an interesting way to think about it. It could help us avoid some of those problems with defining normality that we talked about earlier.
It could. So, as you can see, the concept of health is just as philosophically rich and complex as the concept of disease.
Absolutely. And we've only scratched the surface here. This deep dive has really highlighted the multifaceted nature of these seemingly simple terms.
It has, and it's clear that there are still a lot of open questions and areas for further philosophical exploration.
Like, how do we balance the objective biological aspects of health and disease with the subjective experiences and values of individuals? And how do we create a more holistic understanding of health that encompasses physical, mental, and social well-being?
These are big questions, and the answers have real implications for how we approach medicine, healthcare, and even our own lives.
Absolutely. I mean, how we define these concepts affects everything from medical research to public health policy.
It does. And this whole discussion really touches on some of the most fundamental areas of philosophy. We've talked about ontology, epistemology, ethics, and philosophy of science.
Yeah, it's all connected.
It is. So for our listener, I'll leave you with this. Given all the complexities we've explored, how should we think about disease and health in our own lives and in our society? Is one perspective, like naturalism or constructivism, more compelling than the other? Or do we need to find a way to integrate insights from both? These are tough questions, and I encourage you to keep exploring them. Stanford Encyclopedia Philosophy Entry is a great place to start, but there is a whole world of philosophical literature out there waiting to be discovered. So happy reading, and until our next deep dive, keep those philosophical gears turning.